Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, Chapter 41. The first week was soon gone, the second begun. It was the last of the regiment's stay in Meryton, and all the young ladies in the neighbourhood were sad. The elder sisters alone were still able to eat, drink, and sleep, and pursue the usual course of their employments. Kitty and Lydia were weeping. Good heaven! What is to become of us? What are we to do? They often exclaimed. "How can you smile, Lizzie?" "I am sure I shall break my heart," said Lydia. "If we could go to Brighton," observed Mrs. Bennet. "Oh, yes, if we could go to Brighton, but papa is so disagreeable." Elizabeth tried to stay apart, but all sense of pleasure was lost in shame. But suddenly Lydia received an invitation from Mrs. Forster, the wife of the colonel of the regiment, to accompany her to Brighton. This friend was a very young woman, and very lately married. A resemblance in good humour and good spirits had recommended her and Lydia to each other. The rapture of Lydia on this occasion, her adoration of Mrs. Forster, the delight of Mrs. Bennet, and the mortification of Kitty, are scarcely to be described. Lydia flew about the house in restless ecstasy than ever. "I cannot see why Mrs. Forster should not ask me as well as Lydia," said Kitty, "though I am not her particular friend. I am 2 years older." In vain did Elizabeth attempt to make her reasonable. As for Elizabeth herself, this invitation was so far from exciting in her the same feelings as in her mother and Lydia. She said to Mr. Bennet, "Our importance, my dear father, our respectability in the world must be affected by the Lydia's wild volatility, by her character. Excuse me, for I must speak plainly. In this danger Kitty also is comprehended. She will follow wherever Lydia leads, vain, ignorant, idle, and absolutely uncontrolled." Mr. Bennet, affectionately taking her hand, said in reply, "Do not make yourself uneasy, my love. Wherever you and Jane are known you must be respected and valued. We shall have no peace at Longbourn if Lydia does not go to Brighton. Let her go, then. Colonel Forster is a sensible man, and will keep her out of any real mischief, and she is luckily too poor to be an object of prey to anybody. At Brighton the officers will find women better worth their notice." In Lydia's imagination a visit to Brighton was real earthly happiness. She saw herself the object of attention; she herself seated beneath a tent, tenderly flirting with at least 6 officers at once. Elizabeth had to see Mr. Wickham for the last time. On the very last day of the regiment's remaining at Meryton he dined, with other of the officers, at Longbourn. She mentioned Colonel Fitzwilliam's and Mr. Darcy's staying at Rosings, and asked him if he was acquainted with the former. He looked surprised, displeased, alarmed, but with a smile replied that he had formerly seen him often, and after observing that he was a very gentlemanlike man, asked her how she had liked him. Her answer was warmly in his favour. With an air of indifference he soon afterwards added, "How long did you say he was at Rosings?" "Nearly 3 weeks." "And you saw him frequently?" "Yes, almost every day." "His manners are very different from his cousin's." "Yes, very different. But I think Mr. Darcy improves." "Indeed," cried Mr. Wickham with a look which did not escape her. Elizabeth could not repress a smile at this. She saw that he wanted to engage her on the old subject of his grievances. Lydia returned with Mrs. Forster to Meryton, from whence they were to set out early the next morning. The separation between her and her family was rather noisy than pathetic. Kitty was the only one who shed tears, but she did weep from vexation and envy. Chapter 42. Elizabeth's father, captivated by youth and beauty, had married a woman whose illiberal mind had very early in their marriage put an end to all real affection for her. Respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished for ever, and all his views of domestic happiness were overthrown. But Mr. Bennet was fond of the country and of books, and these were his principal enjoyments. The true philosopher will deserve benefit from such as are given. Elizabeth, however, was not blind. She had always seen everything with pain. Wickham left, and at home she had mother and sister whose constant lamentations made the life unsupportable. But she was dreaming about her tour to the lakes. It was her best consolation. That Lydia went away she promised to write very often to her mother and Kitty, but her letters were always very short. After the first fortnight or 3 weeks of her absence, health and good humour began to reappear at Longbourn. Mrs. Bennet was restored to her usual querulous serenity, and by the middle of June Kitty was so much recovered as to be able to enter Meryton without tears. The time fixed for the beginning of their northern tour was now fast approaching, but Mr. Gardiner could start in July, and must be in London again within a month, and as that left little time for them to go so far, Elizabeth was excessively disappointed. She dreamt of the lakes. Her relatives offered her to visit Derbyshire, and it was impossible for her to go to Derbyshire without thinking of Pemberley and its owner, Mr. Darcy. The period of expectation was now doubled. 4 weeks passed away before her uncle and aunt's arrival, and Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, with their 4 children, appeared at Longbourn. The children, 2 girls of 6 and 8 years old, and 2 younger boys, were to be left with their cousin Jane, who was ready to teach them, play with them, and love them. The Gardiners stayed only one night at Longbourn, and left the next morning with Elizabeth in pursuit of amusement. Mr. Gardiner declared with willingness to visit Pemberley, and Elizabeth did not say a word. "My love, do not you like to see a place of which you have heard so much?" said her aunt. "A place, too, with which so many of your acquaintances are connected. Wickham passed all his youth there, you know." Elizabeth was distressed. She felt that she had no business at Pemberley. She really had no pleasure in seeing rich houses. Mrs. Gardiner noticed, "The views here are delightful. They have the finest woods in the country." Elizabeth said no more. The possibility of meeting Mr. Darcy while viewing the place would be dreadful. Chapter 43. Elizabeth, as they drove along, watched for the first appearance of Pemberley Woods with some perturbation. Finally they turned in at the lodge. The park was very large, and contained great variety of ground. They entered it in one of its lowest points, and drove for some time through a beautiful wood. Elizabeth saw and admired every remarkable spot and point of view. They found themselves at the top of a big hill, where the wood ceased, and the eye was instantly caught by Pemberley House, situated on the opposite side of a valley. It was a large, handsome stone building, standing on rising ground. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more. They admired the view, and at that moment she felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be something. They descended the hill, crossed the bridge, and drove to the door. On applying to see the place they were admitted into the hall. The housekeeper came, a respectable-looking elderly woman. They followed her into the dining parlour. It was a large, well-proportioned room. Elizabeth went to a window to enjoy its prospect. From every window there were beauties to be seen. The rooms were lofty and handsome. "And of this place," thought she, "I might have been mistress. Instead of viewing them as a stranger, I might have rejoiced in them as my own." She wanted to inquire of the housekeeper whether her master was really absent, but had not the courage for it. The question was asked by her uncle. Mrs. Reynolds replied that he was, adding, "but expect his tomorrow, with a large party of friends." Her aunt now called her to look at a picture. She approached and saw the portrait of Mr. Wickham. Her aunt asked her how she liked it. The housekeeper came forward, and told them it was a picture of a young gentleman, the son of her late master's steward. "He is now gone into the army," she added, but I am afraid he has turned out very wild." Mrs. Gardiner looked at her niece with a smile. "And that," said Mrs. Reynolds, pointing to another of the miniatures, "is my master. It was drawn at the same time as the other, about 8 years ago." "I have," said Mrs. Gardiner, looking at the picture. "It is a handsome face. But, Lizzie, you can tell us whether it is like or not." Mrs. Reynolds asked, "Does that young lady know Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth coloured, and said, "A little." "And do not you think him a very handsome gentleman, madam?" "Yes, very handsome." Mrs. Reynolds then directed their attention to one of Mr. Darcy, drawn when she was only 8 years old. "And is Miss Darcy as handsome as her brother?" said Mrs. Gardiner. "Oh, yes, the handsomest young lady that ever was seen. She plays and sings all day long. In the next room there is a new instrument, a present from my master. She comes here tomorrow with him." "Does your master live at Pemberley?" asked Mr. Gardiner. "Not so much as I could wish, sir, but Miss Darcy is always here for the summer month. If your master would marry, you could see him more often." "Yes, sir, but I do not know when that will be. I do not know who is good enough for him. Everybody will say so. You are lucky in having such a master." "Yes, sir, I know I am. I have always observed that they who are good natured when children are good natured when they grow up, and he was always the sweetest tempered, most generous hearted boy in the world." Elizabeth almost started at her. "Can this be Mr. Darcy?" thought she. "His father was an excellent man," said Mrs. Gardiner. "Yes, madam, that he was indeed, and his son will be just like him." Elizabeth listened, wondered, and doubted. Mrs. Reynolds continued, "He is the best landlord and the best master that ever lived. Some people call him proud, but I am sure I never saw anything of it. And he is certainly a good brother." In the gallery there were many family portraits. When they had seen all of the house, they returned downstairs, and took leave of the housekeeper. As they walked across the hall towards the river, Elizabeth turned back to look again. Her uncle and aunt stopped also, and the owner of the house suddenly came forward from the road. Mr. Darcy became immovable from surprise, but shortly recovering himself, spoke to English. He repeated his inquiries about Longbourn and Derbyshire, and she answered. He was speaking very politely, without pride, and Elizabeth was very surprised, and she did not know what to think. Mr. Darcy handed the ladies into the carriage, and when it drove off, Elizabeth saw him walking slowly towards the house. "He is perfectly well behaved, polite, and unassuming," said her uncle. "His behaviour to us more than civil. It was really attentive, and there was no necessity for such attention." "To be sure, Lizzie," said her aunt, "he is not so handsome as Wickham. But why did you tell me that he was so disagreeable?" Elizabeth said that she had liked him better when they had met in Kent than before, and that she had never seen him so pleasant as this morning. Chapter 44. Elizabeth did not think that Mr. Darcy would come to visit them in the inn, but her conclusion was false. But in the very morning the visitors came. Mr. Darcy and her brother appeared, and the introduction took place. Mr. Darcy was tall, much taller than Elizabeth, and, though little more than 16, her figure was formed. She was less handsome than her brother, but there was sense and good humour in her face, and her manners were gentle. Mr. Darcy told Elizabeth that Bingley was also coming to see her, and she had barely time to express her satisfaction and prepare for such a visitor, when Bingley's quick step was heard on the stairs, and in a moment he entered the room. All Elizabeth's anger against him went away. He inquired in a friendly way after her family, and looked and spoke with the same good-humoured ease that he had ever done. Elizabeth had much to do. She wanted to ascertain the feelings of each of her visitors. She wanted to compose her own. Bingley said in a tone which had something of real regret, that it was a very long time since he had had the pleasure of seeing each other, and before he could reply, he added, "It is above 8 months. We have not met since the 26th of November, when we were all dancing together at Netherfield." Elizabeth was pleased to find his memory so exact. There was not much in the question nor in the preceding remark, but there was a look and a manner which gave them meaning. It was not often that she could turn her eyes on Mr. Darcy himself, but whenever she did catch a glimpse, she saw an expression of general complacence. Never, even in the company of his dear friends at Netherfield, or his dignified relations at Rosings, had she seemed so nice and well behaved. Their visitors stayed with them above half an hour, and when they arose to depart, Mr. Darcy expressed their wish of seeing Mr. Darcy and Mr. Gardiner and Mrs. Bennet to dinner at Pemberley before they left the country. Bingley expressed great pleasure of seeing Elizabeth again, hoping to see about her sister. So the visitors went away. Elizabeth's uncle and aunt liked Mr. Darcy very much. They had nothing to accuse him. The people in the country loved him. It was acknowledged that he was a liberal man, and did much good among the poor. Chapter 45. On reaching the house, Elizabeth and her relatives were shown through the hall into the saloon. In this house they were received by Miss Darcy, who was sitting there with Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and the lady with whom she lived in London. Their visit did not continue long, and while Mr. Darcy was attending them to their carriage, Miss Bingley was venting her feelings in criticism on Elizabeth's person, behaviour, and dress. But Georgiana would not join her. "How very ill Miss Eliza Bennet looks this morning, Mr. Darcy!" she cried. "She is grown so brown and coarse. Her face is too thin, her complexion has no brilliancy, and her features are not at all handsome. Her eyes have a sharp, shrewish look, which I do not like at all, and in her air there is something which is intolerable." But Darcy admired Elizabeth. "Yes," replied Darcy, who could contain himself no longer, "but that was only then I first saw her, and now I consider her as one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance." He then went away. Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth talked of all that had occurred during their visit, as they returned. Elizabeth wanted to know what Mrs. Gardiner thought of Mr. Darcy. Chapter 46. When Elizabeth arrived at Lambton, a letter from Jane was waiting for her. "Something was occurred, dearest Lizzie. What I have to say relates to poor Lydia. Colonel Forster informed us that she was gone off to Scotland with Wickham. Imagine our surprise. Our poor mother is sadly grieved. Colonel Forster will come here soon. Lydia left a few lines for his wife. Dearest Lizzie, I have bad news for you, and it cannot be delayed. Nobody knows where they are. Our distress, my dear Lizzie, is very great. My father and mother believe the worst. My poor mother is really ill, and as to my father, I never in my life saw him so affected. My father is going to London with Colonel Forster to try to discover Lydia." "Oh, where is my uncle?" cried Elizabeth, darting from her seat as she finished the letter, in eagerness to follow without losing time. But as she reached the door it was opened by a servant, and Mr. Darcy appeared. Before he could speak she exclaimed, "I beg your pardon, but I must leave you. I must find Mr. Gardiner this moment, on business that cannot be delayed. I have no time to lose." "Good God! What is the matter?" cried he. "I will not detain you a minute, but let me, or let the servant go after Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. You are not well enough. You cannot go yourself." Elizabeth hesitated, but her knees trembled under her. She sat down, unable to support herself, and looking miserably ill. "Let me call your maid." "You are very ill." "No, I thank you," she replied, endeavoring to recover herself. "There is nothing the matter with me. I am quite well. I am only distressed by some dreadful news which I have just received from Longbourn." She burst into tears, and for a few minutes could not speak another word. Then she spoke again. "I have just had a letter from Jane, with such dreadful news. It cannot be concealed from any one. My younger sister has left all her friends, has thrown herself into the power of Mr. Wickham. They ran away. She has no money, no connections. She is lost for ever." "I am shocked indeed," cried Darcy. "Oh, yes! They left Brighton together on Sunday night. My father is gone to London, but nothing can be done. I know very well that nothing can be done. How can one find them? I have not the smallest hope, and it is horrible." Darcy shook his head. He made no answer. He was walking up and down the room, his brow contracted. Elizabeth instantly understood it that everything was lost. "I was really shameful for her family. Please say that urgent business calls us home immediately. Conceal that unhappy truth as long as it's possible." He readily assured her of his secrecy, again expressed his sorrow for her distress, wished it a happier conclusion, and went away. Her uncle returned. They seated in the carriage and were on the road to Longbourn. Chapter 47. "Well, let's suppose that they're in London, Elizabeth," said her uncle as they drove from the town. "They may be here. They have very little money. But why all this secrecy? Why any fear of the detection? If they are going to marry, why must their marriage be private? Oh, no, no, this is not likely. Wickham will never marry a woman without money. He cannot afford it. Lydia has no brothers to step forwards. That's why he is so brave. But can you think that Lydia loves him so much? It does not seem, and it is most shocking indeed," replied Elizabeth, with tears in her eyes. "But really I do not know what to say. But she is very young. She has never been taught to think on serious subjects. Nothing but love, flirtation, and officers are in her head. William has neither integrity nor honor. He is as false and deceitful as he is insinuating. His lies about the whole Pemberley family are endless. But does Lydia know nothing of this? Can she be ignorant of what you and Jane seem so well to understand? Oh, yes, that, that is the worst of all. The necessity of opening her eyes to his character never occurred to me. That she could be in any danger from the deception never entered my head. They travelled as fast as possible, and sleeping one night on the road, reached Longbourn by dinner time the next day. Elizabeth asked Jane if she had heard of the fugitives. "Not yet," replied Jane. "But now my dear uncle has come, I hope everything will be well. Is my father in town?" "Yes, he went on Tuesday." "And have you heard from him often?" "We have heard only twice. He wrote me a few lines on Tuesday to say that he had arrived in safety." "And my mother? How's she? How are you all?" "My mother is tolerably well, I think. Mary and Kitty, thank heaven, are quite well." "But you, how are you?" cried Elizabeth. "You look pale." Her sister, however, assured her of her being perfectly well. Jane ran to her uncle and aunt and welcomed and thanked them both. Many whispered to Elizabeth, soon after they were seated at table, "This is a most unfortunate offer. We must go and do something." Chapter 48. Everybody was in hopes of a letter from Mr. Bennet the next morning, but the post came in without bringing a single line from him. All Meryton was striving to blacken the man who, 3 months before, had been almost an angel. Elizabeth and even Jane became almost hopeless. Mr. Gardiner left Longbourn on Sunday. On Tuesday his wife received a letter from him. It told them that, on his arrival, he had immediately found out his brother, and persuaded him to come to Gracechurch Street, and that he was now looking for the fugitives at all the principal hotels in town. Mr. Gardiner himself did not expect any success from this measure, but as his brother was eager in it, he meant to assist him in pursuing him. There was also a postscript to this letter. At present we have nothing to guide us. Colonel Forster will do everything in his power. But perhaps Lizzie could tell us what relatives that officer could have in London. Elizabeth was ready to help, but that was not in her power to give any useful information. She had never heard of any Wickham's relatives, except the father and mother, both of whom had been dead many years. Every day at Longbourn was now a day of anxiety, but the most anxious part of each was when the post was expected. The arrival of letters was the grand object of every morning's impatience. Mr. Gardiner wrote in his letter that they might expect to see their father at home on the following day, which was Saturday. When Mrs. Bennet was told of this, she did not express so much satisfaction as her children expected. "What! Is he coming home, and without poor Lydia?" she cried. "Sure he will not leave London before he has found them. Who is to fight Wickham, and make him marry her, if he comes away?" When Mr. Bennet arrived, he said as little as he usually did. "Do you suppose them to be in London?" asked Elizabeth. "Yes. Where else can they be so well hidden?" "And Lydia is happy then," said her father drearily. Chapter 49. 2 days after Mr. Bennet's return, as Jane and Elizabeth were walking together in the shrubbery behind the house, they saw the housekeeper coming towards them. She said to Miss Bennet, "I beg your pardon, madam, for interrupting you, but there is a letter for you from Mr. Gardiner." The girls ran away. They ran through the vestibule into the breakfast room, from thence to the library. "Oh, papa, what news? What news? Have you heard from my uncle?" "Yes, I have had a letter from him." "Well, and what news does it bring, good or bad?" "Read it aloud," said their father, and gave them a letter. "Grace Charge Street, Monday, August 2nd. "My dear brother, at last I have seen them both. Then it is as I always hoped," cried Jane. "They are married." Elizabeth read on. "I have seen them both. They are not married, but if you are willing to perform the engagements, I hope it will not be long before they are. Mr. Wickham's circumstances are not so hopeless as they are generally believed to be. I am happy to say there will be some little money, even when all his debts are discharged, to settle on my niece, in addition to her own fortune. Yours, Edward Gardiner." "Is it possible?" cried Elizabeth, when she had finished. "Can it be possible that he will marry her? Wickham is not so bad, then, as we thought him," said her sister. "My dear father, I congratulate you." "And have you answered the letter?" cried Elizabeth. "No, but it must be done soon." "Oh, my dear father!" she cried, "come back and write immediately." "Let me write for you," said Jane, "if you dislike the trouble yourself." "I dislike it very much," he replied, "but it must be done. And they must marry. Yes, yes, they must marry. There is nothing else to be done. But there are two things that I want very much to know. One is how much money your uncle promised him, and the other, how will I give it back to him?" "Money, my uncle!" cried Jane. "What do you mean, sir?" "I mean that no Wickham would marry poor Lydia." "That is true," said Elizabeth, "though it had not occurred to me before. His debts to be discharged, and something still to remain. Oh, it must be my uncle's doings. Generous, good man. A small sum could not do all this." "No," said her father, "Wickham's a tool if he takes less than £10,000. £10,000! How is such a sum to be repaid?" Mr. Bennet made no answer, and each of them continued silent till they reached the house. Their father then went on to the library to write, and the girls walked into the breakfast room. "And they are really to be married!" cried Elizabeth. "How strange this is! Oh, Lydia, Elizabeth took the letter, and they went upstairs together. Mary, after a slight preparation for good news, the letter was read aloud. Mrs. Bennet could hardly contain herself. As soon as Jane had read Mr. Gardiner's letter, her joy burst forth. To know that her daughter would be married was enough. "My dear, dear Lydia," she cried, "this is delightful indeed. She will be married. I'll see her again. She will be married at 16. My good, kind brother, I knew he would manage everything but the clothes, the wedding clothes. I will write to my sister about them directly. Lizzie, my dear, run down to your father, and ask him how much he will give her. Stay, stay, I will go myself. Ring the bell, Kitty. My dear, dear Lydia, how merry we shall be together when we meet." Her eldest daughter reminded her about Mr. Gardiner's help. "Well," cried her mother, "it is all very right. We should do it, but her own uncle. Well, I am so happy. In a short time I shall have a daughter married. Mrs. Wickham. How well it sounds! And she was only 16 last June. Chapter 50. Instead of spending his whole income, Mr. Bennet had laid by an annual sum for the better provision of his children, and one of his wife. If she survived him, now he wanted to discharge the obligation as soon as he could. When first Mr. Bennet had married, economy was useless, for of course they hoped to have a son. 5 daughters successively entered the world, but no arrived. Mr. Bennet had never before supposed that William could marry his daughter. The good news spread luckily through the house. It was a fortnight since Mrs. Bennet had been downstairs, but on this happy day she again took her seat at the head of his table. But Mrs. Bennet found, with amazement and horror, that her husband would not give a guinea to buy clothes for his daughter. Elizabeth was now most heartily sorry that she had told Mr. Darcy about her sister. She began now to comprehend that he was exactly the man who, in disposition and talents, would most suit her. Mr. Gardiner soon wrote again to his brother. The principal purport of his letter was to inform him that Mr. Wickham decided to quit the place and go to the north. Mr. Bennet and his daughters saw all the advantages of Wickham's removal. Jane and Elizabeth wanted to see the couple at Longbourn as soon as they were married, and their mother was satisfied that she would be able to show her married daughters in the neighborhood before she was banished to the north. When Mr. Bennet wrote again to his brother, therefore, he sent his permission for them to come, and it was settled that as soon as the ceremony was over they should proceed to Longbourn.